A question I ask myself frequently is what makes a good sandbox game? What makes them so compelling? Why is that style of game so interesting, at least to me? And I think for me, it ultimately comes down to the type of conflict that arises from those types of games. Generally, you have factions at play. These factions oppose one another in their attempt to gain control or power over the sandbox. Then the party gets involved and the scales are tipped one way or another. So, to achieve that effect, I want to discuss a framework to make your sandbox games come alive. You don't need to start with a big bad villain. You don't need to start with a quest giver that's going to set your players off on some sort of long story arc. For me, what it boils down to is you need to start with tension. Picture a world with factions, rulers, maybe even powerful monsters that are locked in a stalemate. Nobody is moving, nobody is advancing their plans forward because the risks are too high. Maybe the forces that oppose one another are too evenly matched, or the costs to advance those plans are just too steep. This is what I like to call starting with static tension. You have essentially designed a standstill in your gaming environment, your sandbox game, at least to begin with. Then your players arrive, your chaos agents. They poke, they prod, they make a deal with one side, they burn down the wrong castle, they steal some sort of magical regalia, and suddenly that stalemate explodes into dynamic conflict. The world starts to become alive, it starts to roll forward with momentum because of your party's actions. That's how you get a sandbox that feels reactive, dangerous, and alive. Hi, welcome aboard the Earthmote. I'm Randall. Let's go ahead and discuss these ideas a bit further so we can establish this framework and you can use it in your own sandbox games. Static tension is when your world is sort of coiled up like a spring. Your factions, your key players, they want things, they have agendas, they have goals, but they can't quite achieve them. Think of this sort of like the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union were both armed to the teeth, but were locked in this gridlock because neither wanted to throw the first punch. It would have disastrous results for both sides if either party did so. In your game, it could be something like two noble houses vying for a throne, but neither wants to start a long dragged out civil war. Or maybe you have an orc horde that is starting to amass on the border, but they don't want to cross yet because they know there will be retaliation. I think the important part about this idea is that you're setting up a scenario where everyone is waiting. The world is kind of balanced on a knife's edge. Dynamic conflict is what happens the second the players step in and start messing things up. They tilt the balance, or maybe they just topple everything over completely. Maybe they assassinate a minor noble, and suddenly House A has an excuse it's been waiting for to make its move. Or maybe they just kill a monster that's been keeping the factions evenly balanced. Your players are your trigger that release that spring. It suddenly uncoils and the tension turns into chaos as everything goes rocketing forward. And the best part about this type of game is that it's just not scripted. You don't force it, you set up the situation and then you let your players go at it and they make something happen and then you just react from there. Now, why does this work so well? I think this approach does a few things really well that help meet that kind of gold standard for sandbox play. First is the idea that you're really making player agency matter. The world doesn't just run on some sort of rails, it's reacting to what your players are doing. You are responsible for setting up the situation, i.e., your sandbox, but I, as a game master, don't pretend to know what my players are going to do within the sandbox. I don't know who they are going to side with. That's action that unfolds at the gaming table. I don't need to design the mustache twirling capital E and evil villain, the party's choices are going to decide that for us. And that's a really great feeling. Number two, your prep does really pay off a bit more. Instead of plotting story beats, I'm really focused more on sketching out pressures and rivalries between different factions. That's a little bit more reusable, flexible, and easier to improvise as your players make their moves throughout your game. You're putting your effort into characters, locations, and tensions between them. I've found that's always paid off in much bigger dividends for me as a game master rather than trying to force my players into some sort of script that they're just going to ignore anyways. Lastly, it feels a bit more alive. Your players stop seeing the world as a backdrop and start seeing it a little bit more as a living system. They start asking, if we side with the guild on this, how are the barons going to respond? And I think that's really when you've got your players hooked into that sandbox style of play. They aren't really thinking about what I, the game master, want them to do next in order to move them along some sort of pre-scripted plot. They're thinking about what they want to do next within the sandbox environment that I've set up for them to play in. Okay, so how do we actually set this up in our sandbox? I think we can go through this step by step so you can see how this framework is easily applied. Step one, you need to define your factions. I would say pick 3 to 5 factions or powers. These could be anything that you prefer: kingdoms, guilds, cults, tribes, or even a very powerful individual. Next, you need to make sure that they all want something. This could be territory, power, resources, some sort of artifact, could just be survival. It doesn't really matter. Just make sure that they have some sort of goal or thing that they are working towards. Next, on a high level, define their current resources available to that faction. I would include things like population count, if they have any magical abilities, what sort of wealth level are we talking about? Anything that really kind of offers them a strength or advantage, I would just note it down at this point so you can see how they are going to position themselves and utilize those resources to advance their goals forward. Then you should set up a brief outline of what each faction's actions would be next if they could pursue their plans unimpeded. This is important. While their plans are not likely to just go off without a hitch, I think it's a good starting point to know what they would do and how they would do it if they could, because this is going to tell you how they're likely going to react and adapt to changes within the game state once the game fiction starts to take place and things start to happen around them. Step 2, put them in balance. Make sure none of your factions can just outright crush the others. Maybe they're equal in strength. Maybe they rely on one another somehow. Maybe there's some other deterrent like a dragon or a magical weapon. Whatever it is, the situation should be tense but stable currently. This is where you are really kind of building up that standstill environment. When the game starts up, there should be this kind of tentative standstill between the powers. But as we'll see next, that is temporary. Step 3, make the balance fragile. Add a few pressure points into your sandbox. Maybe a contested border, a shaky alliance, a leader that's dying, a resource that's dwindling. These are your cracks in your dam. Step 4, drop your players in. Your players, they don't really need a quest, they just need opportunities, hooks to send them off on adventures. Let them stumble across these pressure points that you've devised. A faction hires them, or they get caught smuggling something into a city, or they explore a ruin that happens to hold a key sacred relic. Now they are in the mix, they're on the game board. Additionally, if you feel like your players aren't moving things along at the pace you'd prefer, then you can start to do some what I call faction turns every so often, maybe every month of in-game passing time. This allows you to see if your factions make any progress on a more macro level towards their goals within your sandbox. If they do, or if they don't, you can proceed to the last step, step number 5. Step 5 is to track the fallout. When the players tip the scales, make sure that the world starts to react. Update your notes, shift who's in power, who's angry, who's desperate. The emergent narrative is going to start to unfold. This lets you put the right characters and factions at the right places and have them act accordingly to the changes that are happening within your environment. Of course, your party's going to continue to change things, so you as the game master are just going to keep updating and adapting accordingly. If you can do those few steps to kind of set up your initial work in your sandbox, you're going to have this great kind of tense situation that's currently at a standstill, but it's going to explode once your players start to explore and do what players do within tabletop role-playing games. So if you want to run a D&D game, I would say don't stress about writing those epic story arcs. Focus on building a world that's wound tight, full of factions that are just waiting for an excuse. Then let your players be that excuse. That's static tension and dynamic conflict. It keeps your prep light, your world alive, and your players invested because they are the key drivers in the decisions that are happening within your world. If you found this useful, let me know in the comments how you've used similar setups in your own games or where your players have totally broke the balance in ways you didn't expect. And if you want more content like this in the future, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps the channel out a lot. Consider checking out Enchanted Nimbus, my monthly newsletter. Thanks for hopping aboard the Earthmote. I'll see you in the next one.